Welcome to the LDCEP Topic Talk. My name is Aaron Baier, and today's topic will be the 2018 budget issues and the impact to people with disabilities. My guests today are Brad Williams, Executive Director for the New York State Independent Living Council, Meghan Parker, Advocacy Director for the New York Association on Independent Living, and Bob Meek, a retired disability rights lawyer. Guys, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
You're welcome.
All right, so first, at the federal level, the president recently signed a $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill, effective through the end of September. Brad, what were some of the priorities and positive impacts in this spending bill?
Well, Aaron, first of all, for independent living, there was a $12 million increase, and $10 million was for the Part C program, which that's direct for the federal Centers for Independent Living. But $2 million was for the Part B program, discretionary spending, and that hasn't seen an increase in over a decade or more. So that was really welcome news. And so independent living is now waiting to receive direction from the administration on community living. The centers themselves in terms of how that increase is going to impact each state, and the increase for each center's award or contract, and then each state for the Part B program in terms of how they are then going to address this increase. So they're moving forward with that. And then overall, this was quite amazing that they reached out and addressed so many different types of human service type programs. I guess assistive technology grants, received additional funding. There's like $2 million for voting access for individuals with disabilities, added on $54 million for vocational rehabilitation state grants. So the voc rehab program in each state got more money. Section 811 mainstream vouchers for people with disabilities saw almost $400 million, $83 million for the Section 811 housing for people with disabilities, and like $300 million more for the Community Development Block Grant program, and $275 million for IDEA state grants, and many more. I mean, these are just some of the highlights.
Yes, it sounds like that's an incredible amount of progress from a budget cycle that wasn't expected to do a lot for people with disabilities. How does that kind of trickle down to people with disabilities in New York State, just to give our listeners an idea?
Well, a lot of these hit state programs, just like the Part B is the state grant. Then it's a matter of maybe looking at a state plan and seeing what the distribution formula is. Are they through state grants? Or whatever that formula is. You might have to refer to a state plan, or are they through existing state grants? Do they have to, or do they have provisions for how they address, increases? Will they have to maybe look at, at such a crucial point in time, in this case mid-year, have to consider, they can't really do a amendment to contracts if that's what this is, contracts. Maybe they have to carry over unexpended funds into the next fiscal year, because you can carry over unexpended federal funds into another fiscal year and plan on its use. So these are all considerations here.
Awesome. So it sounds very positive overall, but are there any downsides from the spending bill for people with disabilities?
I think the downsides, and it'd be great to hear from everyone, First of all, like I said, it's an increase that's going to play out by the end of this fiscal year, mid-year. Doesn't leave you much planning, and so realistically, it's not going to happen. You can't amend contracts in time for this fiscal year. So you have to really exercise expedient state planning for how you're going to then take unexpended state funds, when you know how much it is, and carry it over into, let's call it 2019, and for what proper usage. So you have to get on top of the situations now. What do other people think?
I think that it's great that they've passed spending bill that increases funding for a lot of programs that people with disabilities rely on. And like you said, Brad, it was really unexpected. But given the dynamics in Congress, I guess they needed, support from Democrats who typically support more of the funding for programs like this in order to pass the budget. We'll see. I think it remains to be seen what the downside could be for our community. I think that if we're able to maintain these funding levels, that's a positive. A lot of these programs have been level funded for a long time. And so if we can maintain these funding levels into the next year, that will be a good thing. And that will take work from our community.
My comment is less positive. I think that there is a downside sort of long term, and because this creates such a deficit in the federal budget, and that ultimately that may come back to haunt our community because programs may be on the block because of the need to cut spending drastically at some future date.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if you don't spend it, because this is expenditure-based type funding, you won't get it. So if you don't plan it into next year, you won't get to spend it. And I also wondered about the nature of the agreement on the spending, how it kind of aligns with everyone's kind of self-serving need for the midterm election. So I kind of had that thought as well. So there's a lot of things at play here.
Right, and the other thing I want to say, and I think I heard discussion about this, is that while it sounds like a lot of money when you divvy it up amongst all the states, sometimes the amounts don't seem to be very great, and it might be difficult to do much with them. And although you mentioned that you can carry it over to the next fiscal year, federal dollars. So, I mean, that may be, and that will also allow for more planning. But some money you can do that with, and other types of monies you can't do that with.
I do think that the funding increases for our programs are basically rounding errors when compared to other portions of the budget. So while it could add to the deficit, I think that our programs are underfunded and our funding levels are minuscule compared to other parts of the budget. So I'm not willing to say that's a downside.
So basically where we stand right now is that the federal budget, we have an increase. We have all the states are going to have to kind of wait for direction on how and where and when to spend this money. And then we just kind of hope we can all utilize this money effectively and support its continuation into the next fiscal year and ongoing. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the New York State budget. So on April 1st, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced the $168 billion budget for the fiscal year 2018-19. Megan, what were some of the top priorities that independent living focused on for this budget cycle? And, how strong was the support for those priorities?
Well, Aaron, we had quite a number of priorities, as we always do, but some of our top priorities were a $5 million increase for independent living centers. They have been level funded for well over a decade, and which is causing a lot of problems for the ability of centers to keep operating at the same levels, providing the same services. So that was a top priority. Another one was we were looking for a $10 million increase to a program called Access to Home, which provides home modifications to low-income families to keep people in their homes with their loved ones and out of nursing facilities by providing home modifications. And we're also looking to reestablish the Office for the Advocate for people with disabilities. There is right now no advocacy role in state government for our community. The Justice Center used to have advocates on board, but that role was dissolved. And so we really have nowhere to go for our issues. There is really no voice for us in state government. And so Governor Mario Cuomo, actually back in the early 80s, first established this office. And our current governor, Andrew Cuomo, did sign the executive order to keep that current, but has it's current on paper only. There is no office. So those were a few of our top priorities going into the budget. And I would say that we had support, strong support from the Senate and the Assembly for increased funding for independent living centers and for access to home. The Assembly, particularly the Task Force for People with Disabilities in the Assembly, really supported reinstating the Office for the Advocate for People with Disabilities. And we actually do have quite a bit of support within the governor's office for that as well. Unfortunately, the final budget did not include these priorities.
So it didn't include any of these. I just want to be clear for our listeners. After all that support and all that work, there was absolutely zero funding.
Yeah, the independent living centers received level funding, as did Access to Home, which only gets $1 million a year right now. And that's a 75% decrease where it was a few years ago. And despite the Assembly proposing reestablishing the Office for the Advocate for People with Disabilities, that did not make the final budget either. And our community actually did issue a report card showing that the state really failed us this year. Not only were these top priorities not included, but there were cuts to Medicaid long-term care in the final budget. That's going to make it a lot harder for people to get out of nursing facilities and back home. This was just a really bad budget all around for people with disabilities.
That's incredible, and not in a good way. However, so I want to pose a question to everybody now. On the federal level, independent living has fought for years to get any kind of increase, and probably in one of the least expected years to get an increase under the current administration is when we get one as kind of a surprise. However, in New York State, where it's a very progressive state, led by an administration that is primarily Democratic, and we get all this support and nothing from it. What are some next steps? This kind of climate can be confusing and discouraging to a lot of advocates. So what are some next steps? What must we all do to have a stronger impact on this process going forward?
At the state level, we're calling for budget reforms. We've seen too many years in a row get strong support leading up to the final budget and then not having our priorities included. And we feel like that has a lot to do with the fact that our issues are spread across a lot of tables during the budget process, and we end up having to go to housing, education, health, elections, transportation, just to advocate for our priorities and protect what we already have. And we feel very strongly that we need a budget conference committee dedicated to people with disabilities with table targets, meaning funding attached to it, where they can determine which of those priorities makes it into the final budget, but so that we're not always forgotten at the last minute in the budget. So we think that if we could get that reform enacted, that could make a big difference for us in the state.
Yes, I also think it's a respect issue. We're not getting proper respect either place, and it's as a result the things that we prioritize in terms of issues always fall to the bottom of the pile as they negotiate and they decide upon their issues. And as a result, I think something that's going to be extremely important is we got to find a way to elevate the impact of our vote. Because to them, it's all about vote. It's either vote or money, but let's just talk about the vote, because that's the thing that's going to make a huge impact each and every time. And we are voting. We just got to convince pollsters to track the impact of our vote as voters with disabilities. You know, they talk exhaustively about voting and impact in all these constituency groups, but even the pollsters aren't giving us any respect. And it's almost like we need to do some kind of PR and or media and maybe even a rally and even if, let's say it, an action with pollsters to get them, you know, to do something about this, because this has gone on too long to track the impact of our vote. Because I think whether it's state or national level, they need to understand, you know, the impact of our vote.
And I would just add also that one of the things we should do is try, and I know we do this already, but make redouble our efforts to getting out the vote, the disability community, so that we get the votes and they get tracked.
Definitely. So one more quick follow-up question. So these are some really big priorities now going forward. You know, budget process reform, pollster and voting awareness, education, getting out the vote, getting the disability community to cast their ballots. Especially this year, we're heading into the midterms. The vote's going to matter big time. So what can our listeners do today? Like, is there a good resource for them to go to, a website to learn more about any of this information?
Well, if you'd like more information on how people with disabilities did in the state budget, and I mentioned our report card, you can go to NILE's website at ilny.org to view the report card. And if you go under advocacy priorities to see more information about what the independent living community is working on in New York.
I was just going to add real quick, pollsters, I mean, in New York State, you basically have Marist and you have Zogby, and I'm blanking on the last one. I mean, you literally have to identify the pollsters in our state, and then we want to be able to present to them and make sure that they represent our concerns. So that would be my only other thing, is we need to have a united front against our major pollsters in the state.
And in terms of getting out the vote, the American Association for People with Disabilities, AAPD, has developed quite a lot of materials for their Rev Up campaign to really turn out the disability vote. There is a National Disability Voter Registration Week coming up, I believe in July, and they've created a lot of materials to help advocates get out the disability vote, candidate questionnaires and things like that. And I definitely encourage people to go to their website and look that up, because there's a lot of resources there for getting out the vote.
That was Great. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to our podcast. I want to thank our esteemed guests for their input into the federal and state budgets from this year and what we can do as advocates going forward. Please join us in the future for our upcoming podcasts on the LDCEP website, ldcep.org, and encourage others to join as well. This is a great way to be more civically minded and get more involved in the disability community and in ensuring our rights going forward. Thank you.